What the heck happened to Mirko Cro Cop?
Cro Cop!
Once one of the most feared fighters in both MMA and kickboxing,
Some blood! High kick and knockout!
his legendary high kicks knocked out some of the toughest opponents. But after dominating in Pride and the UFC, Cro Cop seemed to fade from the spotlight.
The fight is almost over!
Injuries, defeats, and a shift in his career left fans wondering, where did he go and what is he up to now? Well, let's find out. Early life and career beginnings. Background in law enforcement and military. Born in Croatia, his early life was no walk in the park. The country was embroiled in political conflict, which would later lead to the Croatian War of Independence. As a young man, Cro Cop didn't just watch from the sidelines. He served in the Croatian army during the war, standing on the front lines for his homeland. But even after the war, Mirko's service to his country didn't stop. He went on to join an elite unit of the Croatian police force, an anti-terrorist group called Luko. This was no ordinary squad. These were some of the toughest, most skilled men in Croatia, tasked with handling some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. It was during this time that Mirko earned his famous nickname, Cro Cop, short for Croatian cop. While serving as a police officer, Cro Cop maintained a disciplined, physically demanding lifestyle. That discipline would soon lead him to another calling, a calling that would eventually make him world famous.
He was fighting Mirko Cro Cop, who was the head of an anti-terrorist squadron in Croatia, and he's a real murderer.
Kickboxing roots. Cro Cop didn't start his combat sports career in MMA. Before the gloves and the cage, he was making a name for himself in the kickboxing world. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. A guy with military training, discipline, and a reputation for being tough as nails, it wasn't long before he found himself drawn to the martial art, particularly kickboxing. In the late 90s, Cro Cop entered the legendary K1 kickboxing organization. K1 at the time was where some of the hardest hitting, most elite strikers in the world competed. It was a brutal proving ground, and if you made it in K1, you were respected as one of the best. Cro Cop went toe-to-toe with some of the biggest names in the sport, including legends like Ernesto Hoost and Jerome Le Banner. Although Cro Cop didn't win the K1 World Grand Prix, he earned a solid reputation as a fearsome kickboxer. His kicks were devastating, his technique sharp, and his athleticism impressive. By the early 2000s, Cro Cop had fought some of the most dangerous strikers in the world and left his mark. But he wasn't content with just being a great kickboxer. Transitioned to mixed martial arts. Cro Cop was always looking for the next challenge, and MMA presented just that. At the time, the sport was still young, but it was growing rapidly. The landscape was dominated by grapplers, wrestlers, jiu-jitsu practitioners, and submission specialists. The thought of a kickboxer stepping into this world was daunting, but Cro Cop wasn't intimidated. In 2001, he made his MMA debut. Now, Cro Cop's initial transition into MMA wasn't without its bumps. He faced seasoned grapplers who wanted nothing to do with his striking game. Early on, he had to learn quickly takedown defense, ground control, and how to avoid getting submitted. His first MMA fight was a draw, but Cro Cop's striking had made it clear that he was bringing something dangerous to the sport. It was only a matter of time before he made his mark. Over the next few years, Cro Cop sharpened his skills. His takedown defense became one of the best in the business, allowing him to keep fights standing and use his striking to dominate. His early fights in organizations like K1 and Pride showcased his ability to adapt and evolve in a new sport that was constantly changing. His MMA career was officially in full swing, and it wouldn't be long before the world took notice. Dominance in Pride FC. Signing with Pride Fighting Championships. So for those of you who are new to the sport, let's set the stage here. Pride Fighting Championships was, during the early 2000s, the premier MMA organization in the world. Based in Japan, Pride was home to some of the best fighters on the planet. Heavyweights like Fedor Emelianenko, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and Vanderlei Silva all fought there. It was a place where the toughest men in the sport came to prove themselves, and Cro Cop was no different. In 2001, Cro Cop signed with Pride FC, and from that moment on, his career took off. The Pride heavyweight division was stacked with talent, and Cro Cop quickly proved that he belonged at the top. His blend of striking skills, takedown defense, and killer instinct made him one of the most dangerous fighters in the promotion. Pride fans loved him, and fighters feared him. Fighting style and signature moves. Let's talk about Cro Cop's style for a minute. Cro Cop fought out of a southpaw stance, meaning his left leg was always ready to fire off that signature head kick. But it wasn't just the left leg you had to worry about. He had a devastating right leg as well. In fact, it became a saying among MMA fans: right leg hospital, left leg cemetery. And believe me, that wasn't just talk. The head kick was Cro Cop's most iconic weapon. His ability to land it with precision and power was unparalleled. Fighters knew it was coming, but they couldn't stop it. He was also incredibly fast for a heavyweight, which made his kicks even more dangerous. He didn't just throw them with power, he threw them quickly and accurately. But here's the thing, Cro Cop wasn't just a one-trick pony. Yes, his kicks were legendary, but his overall striking game was on another level. His hands were sharp, his combinations were crisp, and he could knock you out with punches just as easily as with kicks. And let's not forget about his takedown defense. Cro Cop knew that in MMA, ground fighters would try to take him down to avoid his striking. So he developed some of the best takedown defense in the sport, allowing him to keep the fight standing and forcing his opponents to play his game. Notable fights and victories. During his time in Pride, Cro Cop had some of the most memorable fights in MMA history. One of his most famous victories came in 2004 against Igor Vovchanchin. Igor was a dangerous striker himself, but Cro Cop made quick work of him, finishing the fight with, you guessed it, a head kick knockout in the first round. It was the kind of knockout that made fans sit up and say, this guy is for real. In 2005, Cro Cop fought another MMA legend, Vanderlei Silva. Silva was the reigning Pride middleweight champion at the time and was known for his ferocity and aggressive style. But Cro Cop shut him down. He landed a brutal head kick that knocked Silva out cold. It was another highlight reel moment for Cro Cop and solidified his status as one of the most feared strikers in the sport. But perhaps the crowning achievement of Cro Cop's career came in 2006 when he won the Pride Openweight Grand Prix. This was a tournament where fighters of all weight classes could compete, and it was considered one of the toughest tournaments in MMA history. Cro Cop defeated Josh Barnett in the finals to claim the title. It was a huge moment in his career and cemented his legacy as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Feared reputation. By this point, Cro Cop wasn't just a top fighter, he was a terrifying opponent. Fighters who stepped into the ring with him knew that one mistake could end the fight. His ability to knock people out with a single strike made him one of the most feared men in the sport. His walkouts were legendary. Cro Cop would enter the ring to Duran Duran's Wild Boys, a song that somehow perfectly matched his cold, calculating demeanor. Fans knew that when they heard that song, Cro Cop was about to do some serious damage. But it wasn't just his physical abilities that scared people. Cro Cop had an aura about him. His stoic expressions during walkouts and stare-downs were chilling. He didn't smile, he didn't trash talk. He just stared straight ahead with a look that told his opponents they were in for a long, painful night. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. Transition to the UFC. The big move. In 2007, Cro Cop made the decision to sign with the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC, and this was a massive deal at the time. Pride had been bought out by the UFC, and MMA fans around the world were eager to see how Cro Cop would fare in the octagon. Up until that point, Cro Cop had been one of the best fighters outside of the UFC, and now he was coming to the biggest stage in MMA. The hype was through the roof. Fans expected Cro Cop to come in and dominate the UFC heavyweight division just like he had in Pride. After all, this was the same guy who had been head-kicking people into oblivion in Japan. Surely he would do the same in the UFC, right? Initial fights in the UFC. Cro Cop's UFC debut came in February 2007 against Eddie Sanchez, a relatively unknown fighter at the time. As expected, Cro Cop made quick work of Sanchez, winning by TKO in the first round. Fans were ecstatic. It looked like Cro Cop was ready to take over the UFC heavyweight division. But things took a sharp turn in his second fight. Cro Cop faced Brazilian heavyweight Gabriel Gonzaga in a title eliminator bout. Now, most people expected Cro Cop to win and move on to a shot at the UFC heavyweight championship, but Gonzaga, well, he had other plans. Challenges and setbacks. In one of the most shocking moments in UFC history, Gonzaga knocked Cro Cop out with a head kick, the very technique that Cro Cop had made famous. The knockout was brutal. As Cro Cop fell to the mat, his leg twisted awkwardly underneath him, causing serious injury. The image of Cro Cop lying on the canvas with his leg bent the wrong way is one that fans will never forget. This loss was devastating for Cro Cop, both physically and mentally. Not only had he been knocked out in a way that no one expected, but he had also suffered a significant injury that would take time to heal. The mental toll of that knockout was just as significant as the physical damage. From that point on, Cro Cop struggled to find his footing in the UFC. The octagon was a different beast compared to the Pride ring. The larger space of the octagon and the different rules, such as allowing elbows on the ground, seemed to throw him off his game. Subsequent UFC fights. Cro Cop's UFC run was inconsistent, to say the least. After the Gonzaga fight, he faced Czech Congo, a dangerous striker, and lost by unanimous decision. It was clear that something wasn't clicking for Cro Cop in the UFC. He went on to face fighters like Junior Dos Santos and Frank Mir, but the dominance he had shown in Pride was nowhere to be found. Injuries and age were catching up with him, and the mental impact of the Gonzaga knockout seemed to linger in the background. By 2009, Cro Cop left the UFC and returned to fight in Japan and other promotions. But despite his struggles in the UFC, his legacy as a Pride legend remained intact. Later career and retirement. Return to other promotions. After his UFC stint, Cro Cop went back to fighting in Japan, where he had enjoyed so much success. He competed in organizations like Dream, K1, and even Bellator MMA later on in his career. Returning to Japan seemed to reinvigorate Cro Cop. The familiar environment, the rules, and the smaller rings allowed him to get back to what he did best, putting on a show for the fans and knocking people out. He had some solid victories during this time. In 2012, Cro Cop won a rematch against Ray Sefo in a kickboxing bout. Then in 2016, he won the Ryzen World Grand Prix, a tournament similar to the one that he had won in Pride a decade earlier. Winning the Grand Prix in the twilight of his career was a testament to Cro Cop's resilience and fighting spirit. The last fight. On February 16, 2019, Cro Cop stepped into the Bellator cage for what would turn out to be the final fight of his incredible career. His opponent was Roy Big Country Nelson, a man that Cro Cop had faced once before in the UFC back in 2011. That fight had ended with Cro Cop on the losing end via TKO. But this time, things were different. At Bellator 216, Cro Cop secured a unanimous decision victory against Nelson, avenging his earlier loss. This was a moment of triumph for the 44-year-old Croatian. Fans were excited, and some even began speculating that Cro Cop might make a run for the Bellator heavyweight title. However, just 2 weeks after that victory, Cro Cop's career came to a sudden and unexpected end. On March 1, 2019, Mirko appeared on Vennik Nova TV, a Croatian news program, for what fans assumed would be a routine interview, maybe discussing future fights or reflecting on his recent victory over Nelson. But instead of talking about what was next in his fighting career, Cro Cop dropped a bombshell. With a somber look on his face, Cro Cop told the world that his fighting career was officially over. He had suffered a stroke just days before and had only just been released from the hospital. It was a sad end to an illustrious career, but Cro Cop knew that his health had to come first. He left the sport with a professional MMA record of 38 wins, 11 losses, and 2 draws, along with countless highlight reel knockouts and tournament victories. Cro Cop had nothing left to prove. He had done it all. Political career. But Cro Cop's story doesn't end with his fighting career. While he was still competing, Cro Cop entered the world of politics. In 2003, he was elected to the Croatian parliament as a member of the Social Democratic Party. For a lot of people, this came as a surprise. Here was a guy known for kicking people's heads off, and now he was stepping into the world of government. But Cro Cop wasn't just using his name for attention. He was serious about making a difference in his country, and he brought the same discipline and focus to politics that he had in the fight game. During his time in Parliament, Cro Cop focused on issues like national security and sports development. As someone who had served in the military and law enforcement, he was passionate about keeping his country safe. He also pushed for better opportunities for young athletes, hoping to improve the infrastructure of sports development in Croatia. Legacy and impact on MMA. Influence on future fighters. Cro Cop's legacy in MMA is undeniable. He inspired a whole generation of fighters, particularly strikers who wanted to make the transition to MMA. His success showed that a strong striking background could translate into a successful MMA career if you adapted your game properly. Fighters like Israel Adesanya, who came from kickboxing backgrounds, often cite Cro Cop as one of their influences. The way Cro Cop incorporated his kickboxing into MMA set the blueprint for many fighters who came after him. His legendary head kick became something that every striker in the sport aspired to replicate. If you've seen a highlight reel of a head kick knockout in MMA, you can bet that Cro Cop's influence is all over it. Impact on the sport. Cro Cop wasn't just important for his individual achievements. He helped raise the profile of MMA worldwide, especially in Europe. In Croatia and the surrounding countries, Cro Cop's success brought attention to the sport in a way that few others could. He made MMA mainstream in places where it had previously been a niche sport. He was also known for his professionalism. In a sport where trash talk and bad blood often take center stage, Cro Cop was always respectful. He didn't need to run his mouth, his fists and feet did the talking. That level of professionalism earned him the respect of fans, fighters, and promoters alike. Place in MMA history. Cro Cop may not have had the success in the UFC that some fans expected, but that doesn't diminish his place in MMA history. He is still considered one of the greatest heavyweight fighters of all time, especially when you look at his Pride days and his overall accomplishments. He has been inducted into several MMA Halls of Fame and has received numerous Lifetime Achievement Awards for his contributions to the sport.